it on Saturday. I don't think we'll have to wait for 4 days. I hope we don't have to wait for 4 days. I think it'll boil down to Pennsylvania. Whoever wins Pennsylvania will win the White House. I think it's as simple as that. If Harris wins Pennsylvania, and it is a must-win for her, then she will win the White House. If Trump wins Pennsylvania, then that's the end of the night. So I think it really boils down to that one state. That state closes at 8 p.m. Eastern time. The difference
for
this
us,
time compared to 2020
your show all the way.
was that in...
Take it away.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so welcome to this special edition of the Race for the White House. We're coming to you live from just off the south lawns of the White House, the beautiful structure that was built way back in the 17th century overlooking us. And really, we are at the cusp of history, either way that you look at it. If Kamala Harris wins, the White House gets the first ever woman resident, the first ever woman president of the United States. She will be the 47th president of the US if she were to win. And if Donald Trump were to win, he would be the first president in over 100 years who lost after the first term, demitted office, and then came back and won a second term 4 years later. So either way, it's going to be history making, and you kind of get that feeling today in Washington. You feel like this day something big is going to happen across this country. And this is an election that matters not just to the 150, 160 million Americans who will be casting their vote today. Remember, already almost 78, 79 million Americans have voted, which is half the electorate, half the voter turnout from last time have already voted either in mail-in ballots or through early in-person voting. So it's the other half that will turn up today. And the big question is, which of the two sides is more motivated? Is the Republican base, the MAGA, the Make America Great Again base that Trump has constructed over the last 8 years, are they more motivated to turn out in larger numbers today? Or is it this coalition of women, largely college-educated, white, suburban women, which Kamala Harris seems to have stitched together, who will turn up in larger numbers? And they certainly matter in those battleground states of 7 of them: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the 3 blue wall states, and then you have the 4 other Sun Belt states in Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, and Arizona. Which way will America decide? It has, like I said, consequences not just for this country, but right around the world. Let's start this special broadcast, the Race for the White House, beginning now.
The most important issues on the ballot for me are access to health care for women.
A lot of criminals, they have a criminal record and they're still being allowed to come into the country.
Most basic one is the economy.
Trade policies. I like to promote American workers more.
I will restore peace in the world, and I will rescue the American dream. My message to Americans tonight is simple. We do not have to live this way. We don't.
We are not going back. We are not going back. And this could be one of the closest races in history. Every single vote matters.
Well, like I said, it's been a long, arduous campaign, both for Kamala Harris and for Donald Trump, and it boils down to today. Which of the two sides, the Democrats or the Republicans, are able to turn out the base far more and in greater numbers? Which of the two bases are more enthused? Also, Kamala Harris in the last week or so has been banking on what is called the Nikki Haley Republican voter. Women who care about the abortion issue. Remember, this is the first presidential election since the overturning of Roe versus Wade. For a large number of women, suburban women, white women with college degrees, this is the number one issue on top of their ticket. For the wider electorate, it's about the economy. There was the ABC News Ipsos poll that came out a couple of days ago, which showed that economy is the number one issue for almost a third of Americans. And then, of course, there is also that rider that more than 70% of Americans feel that the country is not on the right track. And whenever that has happened, it is always voted anti-incumbent. So, I want to lay out the cards at the top of the show. For Kamala Harris, it's a straight and narrow path to victory. She has to win Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the blue wall states. She wins those three, she wins the White House. For Donald Trump, there are multiple options, and we will know later tonight. Remember, at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, which is 5:30 a.m. Wednesday morning in India, you will have Georgia close. If Trump retains Georgia, then the path becomes narrower for Kamala Harris. She has to win three blue wall states. If Harris wins Georgia, then it really blows up. Then it really opens up the race in a way that no one quite expected. None of the polls in Georgia so far have shown Harris leading. They've all shown a tight neck and neck within the margin of error poll. But remember, Biden won Georgia last time around by a mere 12,000 votes. It was the first time a Democratic candidate won Georgia in over 30 years. Bill Clinton was the last Democrat to win Georgia in 1992. So that's the first indicator to pick up. Then North Carolina, again, big state, 16 electoral college votes. Biden did not win North Carolina last time around. So if Harris flips North Carolina, that would again be a huge indicator that this race has been blown wide open. If she wins either of Georgia or North Carolina, she has multiple paths to 270. But as I suspect, and as the polls have been saying, that Trump is expected to carry Georgia, Trump is expected to carry North Carolina. Then we come to 8 p.m. Eastern Time, which is 6:30 a.m. on Wednesday morning in India. That's when Pennsylvania will close. That is the biggest state, the biggest battleground state, 19 electoral college votes. No president since 1980 has won the White House without winning Pennsylvania. Even when Trump won in 2016, he had to win Pennsylvania. When Biden won last time, he won Pennsylvania. And if Harris has to win today, then she has to win Pennsylvania. So all roads in that sense lead to Pennsylvania. But let's open this up to our guests and try and make sense of the rather historic nature of this election. Because we have seen both of these candidates sparring off for the better part of the last 3 months. Remember, Harris was never meant to be the candidate in the first place. She became the candidate because Joe Biden pulled out of the race when it was apparent to everybody, including to himself and his family and friends, that he was not in a position for the toughest job in the world. He was in a position of active mental decline, and he withdrew in the third week of July. So Harris has basically put together this campaign in the last 3 months or so, in the last 107 days to be exact. And if she wins tonight, it will be making history in more ways than one. Let me now open this up to our guest. Timothy Roma is former American ambassador to India. Mr. Gopalan Balachandran, very special guest joining us. He's an academic and an uncle of Kamala Harris. We'll be speaking to him extensively through the program. Professor Richard Painter is the former ethics lawyer of the White House. Professor Peter Kuznick is a professor of history and director of nuclear studies at the American University. And Harshvardhan Shringla, former foreign secretary to the government of India. Mr. Gopalan, let me start with you because it is quite surreal. I'm coming to you live from Washington, D.C. I'm overlooking the White House. And here we are in this moment where your niece, in about 12 hours, maybe about 15 hours time till we get the final results, is one step away from becoming the first ever woman president of the United States, the first ever African American woman president of the United States, and certainly the first ever Indian American president of the United States. What do you feel on a day like today?
Look, this is really not a question to ask. If any of the panelists that are here, and if one of the relative, father, sister, brother is going to be the president, you ask them, how do you feel? They're not going to say, oh, I'm not happy at all. So it goes without saying that either niece or daughter, anybody, becomes a big president. Anybody, if she becomes the Indian president, I'll be happy. So that's not a question to ask at all. Okay? Now, my interest in this election is not because of Kamala Harris is my niece. Yes, I like her. My Shamla was my very favorite sister. But the point is this. I've been studying India-US relations for the last 30 years. And it is an important element for our future growth and of our future security. I'm interested more from that point of view than from the point of view that Kamala Harris is my niece. Okay? But I will be very happy. Okay? There's no question about it. But that goes without saying. Anything else?
Mr. Gopalan, I do want to ask you though, I think you were here in the States back in August when she was at the
Yes.
Democratic National Convention. She officially became the Democratic Party's candidate. Did you get a chance to speak to her? You know, what did you tell her? What did she tell you? Just give us some insights.
Let me tell you, she had invited me and my daughter and everybody for dinner at her place the day Biden announced that he was not going to run. She has just come from some outside campaign trip, but for two reasons, I've been very quiet about talking about Kamala for two reasons. One, the US politics is so toxic. That I say will be construed by the Republican and Trump supporters as Indians interfering in US affairs. So I kept quiet. I got my own views on many of the policies of US, which I thought I will not talk about for the last 2 years. But today and tomorrow, certainly I can talk because nothing they say will affect the outcome of the election. Two, I have talked politics with her, but then I never had really much difference because Shamla and I had same viewpoint on many of the issues. And I don't think I had many difference of opinion with Kamala on many things. Okay? So I didn't. And thirdly, as an uncle, you will, I am an uncle, I'm much older than that. What? I am at least 25 years older than her. So you feel a little bit more saying, I know everything, I don't want to talk. Okay? But I was with her when she ran for the Attorney General. I went with her to Sacramento and we had a talk on the way. And I was quite happy with some of the views that she expressed. Okay? So I'll be very happy.
Okay.
I don't see any difficulty at all in being able to reconcile my own political and social views with that of Kamala. I can't say the same thing about Trump.
Okay. All right, Mr. Gopalan, wish you all the very best. We'll be in touch with you. Let's see if in the next 12 hours we'll get to know whether Kamala Harris becomes the first ever woman president of the United States or whether Donald Trump gets a second term in office. Let me also go across before we go to our guest. Ivan Rodriguez is the CNN correspondent. He's joining us live from West Palm Beach, Florida, which is, of course, the Trump HQ. Ivan, thank you for speaking with us. What is the mood in the Trump campaign? And just if you can throw some light for our viewers on the closing arguments of both the candidates. Yesterday, Trump was in Michigan, he was in Pennsylvania, he started the day in North Carolina. Harris, on the other hand, is just going all in on Pennsylvania. She had 5 rallies, all 5 of them on Monday, in the crucial battleground state of Pennsylvania.
Zaka, good morning. Well, here the mood from Trump top aides from former President Trump is that they're cautiously optimistic that he will succeed. But again, they're also pointing to the fact that it's all going to be dependent on voter turnout, whether he does succeed and return to the White House, or whether we see him lose the election, whether that's tonight or a few days from now. But it's all pointing to voter turnout for them. That's a big reason why they've been hitting those key battleground states. As you mentioned, yesterday we saw Vice President Kamala Harris in Pennsylvania actually holding 5 events. She even went door knocking in a neighborhood, spoke with voters in front of their homes as well. Former President Trump making stops in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and ending his campaign final stop in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And Zaka, that's actually the same place that he ended his 2016 and 2020 presidential run. So showing a little bit there of his superstitious side as well.
In the battlegrounds, and I think, I don't know a last election which has shown this kind of a split where the northern states, Wisconsin slightly towards Harris, even though it's very much a dead heat in many of these states. It's well within the margin of error. And in the so-called Sunbelt states, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, Trump seems to have a slight edge. What may that mean eventually when it comes down to it, the path to 270 in these battlegrounds for both Harris and for Trump?
Well, look, Zaka, there's been so much emphasis, right, on the polling, what they look like. As you mentioned, a lot of these states well within that margin of error, making it pretty much a toss-up. I think now that we're in election day, what we're hearing from a lot of people is the projections are just sort of that, right? The projections. And from there, we can't really gather anything else. It's going to be out dependent on the voter turnout that we see here. But to go back to those battlegrounds in the blue wall states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and also Pennsylvania, a path for Harris really looks dependent on securing that blue wall, which Joe Biden was able to do back in 2020. And now if Trump is able to win at least one of those, it really opens up more of an interesting race, because now we're looking at other key battleground states along that Sun Belt. We're looking at North Carolina, which Trump narrowly won in 2020. Democrats have been eager to flip it ever since then. Then we're looking at Georgia. Joe Biden won that by more than 11,000 votes. We head over to Arizona, where Biden won that more than 10,000 votes, and also Nevada. But again, if Harris is able to get that blue wall locked down in a way, that's her clearest path from what we're being told from her campaign officials to victory. But for Trump, an emphasis on that Sun Belt, really focusing from his campaign that they don't lose any of those states. That's detrimental to his campaign as well.
All right, Ivan Rodriguez, live for us from West Palm Beach, Florida, which is the place where Trump is and will be through the day today. Thank you for joining us here on this broadcast. The race for the White House is coming to you just off the south lawns of the White House. Let's open this up to our guests. Ambassador Roma is with us, Mr. Painter, and Ambassador Shringla is also there. Ambassador Roma, let me start with you. I mean, I know that it's a tougher, narrower path for Kamala Harris. She has to win all three of the so-called blue wall states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. You know, as Ivan was saying a moment ago, the polls and the projections don't matter anymore. They are what they are. Ultimately, what matters is who turns out the vote more today. Why do you believe Harris and the Harris campaign have a better shot of turning out the vote more than Trump and his campaign?
Well, nice to be with you, and it's an exciting day here in America. I have not cast my vote yet. I will go in the next couple hours here in the state of Virginia to cast my ballot. So very exciting times, yard signs everywhere. People know their vote really counts and will be counted. And there are not enough terms in the language today: jump ball, coin toss, razor thin. We're seeing, these terms used not only for the presidential race between Mr. Trump and Vice President Harris, but also in the Senate for control of the Senate, which could come down to just one or two seats. In the House of Representatives, some predictions are saying the Democrats might win the 435-seat House by one single race. So every vote counts. We hope in America we're going to have a peaceful transfer of power, condemnation of violence from any side, and acceptance of the results of the election. Now, to your question, why do I think Harris has some momentum right now? I was just up in Pittsburgh for 3 or 4 days campaigning for the Harris election, and I found, one, that her get out the vote effort is exceptionally strong. It may not be as strong as we had in 2008 for Barack Obama, but it's a lot better than 2016. Mm-hmm. And there's excitement, there's volume, there are people going out knocking on neighbors' doors with the identification of who lives there, how they vote, and whether you can give them a ride to the polls or whether they've already voted. So that's one thing. Get out the vote, the army of volunteers. I think that's a slight advantage to Harris right now. Second, I think Harris has raised more money, has more advertising on, has more social media ads going forward. And I think that is a substantial advantage for her, several $100 million in campaign spending, which can also bleed back into get out the vote efforts. And I also think that she's come across in the last 5 or 6 days more as the change agent. Americans want change in this election. Initially, 74% of them did not want Trump. They did not want Biden. They wanted a new candidate. They have one now in the last 90 days in Kamala Harris, and she's beginning to really hit the message hard about why she's the change agent for a better economy, why to save democracy, and how to protect your freedoms, whether it's reproductive rights or whether it's freedom of democracy and voting.
It's interesting you say that, because the attempt by the Trump campaign has been to completely link her and Biden by the hip, saying that the economic mess, or at least people find themselves not economically well off today than they were 4 years ago. They want to pin it both on Harris and on Biden. Of course, the Harris campaign making the attempt that she would have done things differently, at least economically speaking, particularly when it comes to the prices of groceries, etc. But I want to focus on one critical factor with Ambassador Shringla. We've talked about who's better for India. Is it Trump or is it Harris, so on and so forth. Without getting into that, one interesting thing that when I spoke to some of the Indian American folks here, people who've always voted Democrat and who will continue to vote Democrat, is that they say that they're not feeling like, we're on the cusp of voting in the first ever Indian American as President of the United States. Now, obviously, there is a political reason for it. Harris, I'm not saying knowingly, but certainly her campaign wants to press the case that press the case of her African American heritage, and that's understandable. I mean, the African American vote is about 13-14% across the country. So that's purely from a demographic point of view understandable. The Indian American vote is probably 1%. But it's the feel. It's the feeling that we're just not feeling like we have the first ever Indian American to occupy the White House. That's not coming through, even though a large majority of the Indian American community will vote Democrat, as they always have. Ambassador Shringla.
So, I think you're absolutely right in saying that Kamala Harris has underplayed her Indian roots, and I would put it purely on political considerations. After all, if she doesn't project herself as African American, she may not gain that African American vote, and that's what matters in politics in the United States. So it's understandable from a certain perspective, but you have to see that in 2020, when she was a candidate for the presidential elections, there was a lot of euphoria, especially in Tamil Nadu, in the area that her family comes from, etc. So this time there's less enthusiasm. And one of the reasons for that could be the same, downplaying of the Indian roots, the fact that, she hasn't visited India in the last 4 years as vice president, and also not spoken about India. If you see her entire campaign, India hasn't figured in her commentary, whereas Trump has spoken about India on a number of occasions. All of which doesn't really amount to any factor as far as India is concerned, because there is no doubt that she would continue to have a strong policy that would support India-US relationship and a momentum that has been created by her predecessors. But I'm just talking, we're just talking about the mood among the Indian American community, but also back in India in terms of the response generated by the fact that you have an Indian American candidate for US presidency. On the other hand, of course, even on the Trump campaign, you've got J.D. Vance's wife, who's Usha Chilikuri Vance, who's also of Indian origin.
Correct.
So there is a factor, an Indian factor is there in the presidential elections, whether we like it or not. There is a strong Indian element. There is some interest from that point of view. So the entire race is not without its huge interest factor, but the ethnic factor has become much less, simply because of the fact that Kamala Harris has not really focused on the Indian aspect of her roots, as opposed to the African American element.
So let me also get Professor Painter in on this. One of the things that we're seeing in the early vote, 78, 79 million Americans have already voted. And in some key battleground states, we're seeing this in Michigan, we're seeing this in Wisconsin. We also saw this in Iowa, which is not a battleground state, but the Seltzer poll, which came out over the weekend, seeming to suggest that women are turning up almost 10% more than men, and they are breaking for Harris. And this is obviously on the back of the Dobbs Supreme Court verdict, the overthrow of Roe versus Wade. Do you think if Harris were to win tonight, and hopefully we will know later tonight, but if Harris were to win tonight, this is the one issue that she would have won on?
Well, every voter is going to have different issues that are their priority, and certainly the right to choose with respect to pregnancies is an important issue for women and men. There's a strong feeling in this country that the government shouldn't be regulating people's personal lives, but there are other issues as well, and I think that one of the difficulties that Donald Trump is going to experience here is that he has condoned violence, and he has excused what happened on January 6th of 2021. And regardless of who wins this election, we are going to have a peaceful transfer of power in the United States. We are not going to tolerate violence. There is no excuse for violence from the extreme right or the extreme left. And Donald Trump has not made that point clear. He has not condemned the insurrectionists of January 6th. Indeed, he's been criminally charged in connection with that insurrection. And yes, we do have extremists who are violent on the far left. We have them trying to take over our universities and intimidate our Jewish students. We have those problems, but those elements have not infiltrated the Democratic Party anywhere near to the extent that the extremist elements have infiltrated the Republican Party. It's critically important to repudiate extremism and violence. There is no excuse for that type of behavior, and Donald Trump has not shown himself to be the type of leader who can effectively lead a democracy. And I think that's a big issue for a lot of Americans, including people like myself, who are quite a bit more conservative, certainly than the Democratic Party. And the center of gravity in the Democratic Party, but we're not going to tolerate anyone in the White House who believes there's an excuse for violence or who makes up facts. I mean, Donald Trump lost in 2020. He may win tonight, but he lost in 2020. There's objective truth, and people don't recognize objective truth shouldn't be employed anywhere, much less in the White House.
I do want to press on that point before I go to Professor Kuznick right after this. How much of a worry is that he will not concede? He's not conceded for 2020, and if tonight he loses, and it's likely to be a much closer election tonight than it was 4 years ago, that he will not concede. Already he's sort of ginning up his base to say that they're going to steal the election, they're going to fraudulently take away this election, and so on and so forth. Or is America better prepared than it was on January 6, 2021?
Well, there will be a winner or a loser. We may not know tonight. It may take a few days. It may be like Bush versus Gore, which took a few weeks for the Supreme Court of the United States finally to rule. But there will be a winner and a loser, and the winner will become the next president of the United States. And people can protest all they want. If people get violent, they're going to get put in jail. The governors are standing by, ready to deal with it. There's a false rumor floating around that the Biden administration is thinking of using the military in connection with this election in the aftermath. That's absolutely a lie, completely unnecessary. The vast, vast majority of the American people will not tolerate violence in response to this election. So if Donald Trump concedes or doesn't concede, isn't going to make a lot of difference. And we're going to have a new president on January 20th, either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris.
I'd like to just jump in on that question, too.
Professor Kuznick,
I think America is much better prepared in 2024 than we were in 2020 for a false claim by anybody, whether it's Donald Trump or somebody else, whether it's the Russians, whether it's the Chinese trying to hack into our election systems and sow doubt between our people and divide our people. America is much better prepared. I'm part of a bipartisan, nonpartisan, cross-partisan effort of Democrats and Republicans working together, people that have served in the Senate, the House, and ambassador and governor positions from both parties who have been saying for the last 6 months, we are going to be patient in counting the votes. We are going to condemn all violence from either side. We are going to support a peaceful transfer of power, and both sides should accept a free and fair election result. We already have, the examples of prominent Republicans like Governor Kemp in Georgia, who spoke out as a Republican saying there was no fraud in the 2020 election. So people are prepared, and I think hopefully this election will go smoothly.
So let me get Professor Kuznick in. The contrast in both the candidates and their closing messages. Kamala Harris seems to have gone back to her original theme, which is of joy and hope and optimism. This whole joyful warrior thing, we saw evidence of that in the last few days and last few of her rallies. In fact, I don't think she even mentioned Donald Trump by name, even though it was very obvious the choice as she laid it out before the American people. Trump, on the other hand, has been a bit negative. After all, I mean, he is running against the incumbent, and he's painted this picture of everything going bad and everything going to the dogs in America, and he's the guy to fix it. The question is, which of these two messages is resonant? And in that, I also want to ask, Trump doesn't seem to be making an attempt to reach out to those independents or people who've not made up their mind. He's more interested in charging up his base and ensuring that his base turns up today on election day more than reaching out to independents who may break away from voting for the Democratic candidate and instead vote for the Republican. Why is that?
This is going to be a turnout election. Trump figures that if he can turn out all of his potential voters, he's going to win. But as the congressman said before, the Democrats have a much better ground game than the Republicans do. The Republicans have given their ground game over to Elon Musk, who put $75 million into this, and it seems to be floundering. The Democrats, on the other hand, have got people out there. I was talking to my students last night. They were going to North Carolina. They were going to Pennsylvania. So they are much more energized in that way. So I think that's going to break in the favor of the Democrats. But the point you were making is a very important one. Trump's message, as this campaign is nearing its end, has gotten darker and darker and darker. And so Kamala Harris is contrasting that by a much more upbeat, positive message. She talks about unifying America. She says she's going to be the president for all Americans, while Trump is talking about using the military, using the judicial system to lock up his enemies. She makes the point over and over again that when she gets to office, she's going to have her to-do list to help the American people. When Trump gets to office, he's going to have his enemy list to lock people up. So that message, I think, is resonating. And she also talks about solutions to climate change. She talks about women's health issues, reproductive rights. She talks about a much more inclusive message about immigrants. So I guess we have a real choice. Some of Trump's former top supporters and generals, Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Kelly, who was Trump's personal chief of staff. Milley, for example, says, now I realize he's a total fascist. He's the most dangerous person to this country. And Kelly said similar things, as have Esper and other top officials in the Trump administration. So that message is also getting out there that this is not a normal election. That Harris, for all her faults, and I'm very critical of her, especially her foreign policy, is going to abide by the Constitution, is going to maintain American democracy, and will concede if she's defeated. But as we were saying before, Trump was not going to concede. In fact, it's very likely Trump will claim victory tonight, even though there is no basis for doing so. And he is not going to abide by the Constitution. And as Professor Painter was saying, he is going to probably do what he did in 2020, in January 6th, and try to overturn the results of the election. So this choice is clear as can be. And I think we're mostly in the consensus about this.
So I want to get Ambassador Romer back because, we've been here for the last 3 days now, and you speak to people, they are willing to say that they think Trump will win. They are willing to say that they have voted for Trump in a way that I didn't see in 2020 or in 2016. because of two reasons. One, they feel like, these two wars that are going on, it takes a strong man to stop them, and they think that Trump is the one to do it, not Harris or Biden. And the other one is the economy. People feel, even though the top line numbers look great, the stock markets are going through the roof and stuff, people feel like inflation's really biting them, and the only person who can fix that, whether he can or not, we don't know, but they feel that because he's a businessman, he can somehow fix the inflation and cost of living crisis. How do you speak to that? Speak to specifically those two concerns, ending the wars and fixing the economy?
Well, both good questions, and I did get a lot of those types of questions up in Pennsylvania in the rural communities and up in Pittsburgh in the city itself. I don't think most Americans are focused on foreign policy right now. For better or worse, most of the concern and most of the questions are about the economy and inflation and housing costs. They're about reproductive rights and freedom and protecting our democracy. They're about immigration and border control. Very few people are asking those important questions that I wish more Americans would spend time thinking about, is how will these two candidates approach Ukraine and the war in Ukraine from very different perspectives. I think Harris's approach would be more along the Biden approach, to continue to have partnerships with NATO, to continue to be proactive in trying to strategically arm Ukraine to protect its sovereignty and its freedom, the courageous fighting that the people are doing, and to continue to encourage people like Prime Minister Modi, when he meets with Mr. Zelensky, to be a peacemaker, to be somebody who can be in the middle and encourage both the Russians and the Ukrainians to peace. So the foreign policy issues are just not at the tip of people's tongues, nor as important. And such is the case with the bilateral relations between the U.S. and India. I think Mr. Trump would probably reinforce more tariffs and possible, increasing those significantly on India. He tends to look at a country with the basic trade deficit rather than the strategic relations and the importance that India brings in balancing China, in our economic growth and our democratic principles and shared values. So I think Vice President Harris is probably going to be a better friend in the U.S.-India relationship than Mr. Trump would. We do have bipartisan support for the U.S.-India relationship in Congress. Both Democrats and Republicans support that strong relationship.
All right, we'll see how this plays out. I want to thank all our guests, and I'm sure they'll be with us through the night and through the next few days. The important things to watch out for tonight, like I said, 6 p.m., most of the East Coast states shut, but they're not as relevant as the battleground states. 7 p.m. is when the first big battleground state, Georgia, closes. Watch out for that. Then 7:30 North Carolina, and the big one is 8 p.m. Eastern, which will be 6:30 a.m. tomorrow morning in India when Pennsylvania closes. And frankly, to my mind, it just boils down to this one state. Whoever wins Pennsylvania will win the White House. That's been the case since 1980. I don't see that changing in 2024. Quick break. On the other side, I've got an exclusive conversation with Dhruv Jaishankar of the ORF America. We're talking about the Indian American vote, why, and we alluded to this earlier on in the program, why there isn't as much enthusiasm in the Indian American community at the very fact that one of their fellow Indian Americans is on the cusp of making history and becoming the first ever woman president of the United States. I also spoke to Shri Thanedar, who is again an Indian American congressman from Michigan, from a swing state, and why he believes Harris has his home state of Michigan in her pocket. So those two interviews coming up right on the other side of this quick break. Stay tuned to this special edition of The Race for the White House, coming to you live from just off the South Lawns of the White House.
This धन्यवाद.
So it's the big election in America between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. While there is so much interest in India and around the world as to who will become the next president of the United States, it ultimately boils down to a bunch of swing states, some important communities, whether they show up at the vote or not. We'll also talk about the Indian American community, whether they are overwhelmingly Democrat or they split. Let's try and find a little bit more about this U.S. election, which is being closely watched, with Dhruv Jaishankar, Executive Director with ORF America. Thank you very much, Dhruv, for speaking with us. So, big picture, I mean, we're a day away from election day. Just how big is this election? What are the stakes?
It's a big election. It feels like every 4 years there's a big election in the U.S. It's a very divided polity. Roughly 45% of Americans vote Republican, 45% vote Democrat. And really it's only about 5 to 10% whose opinion has to be swayed each election. And the divides are quite deep across age lines, gender lines, cultural lines, rural, urban. I think there's a big divide there. So I think this is playing out again as it is every 4 years.
What do you think it'll boil down to? I mean, in such a close race, is it the swing states? Is it who's motivated more? Is it anti-incumbency? What's the big X factor?
There are lots of X factors, which is what's making it hard to predict. The polls show pretty much a 50-50 split. 7 states will really determine this election. They're called the swing states. I find it hard to believe the winner will not be the winner of Pennsylvania. I think that will be a state that just mathematically, unless many other results go in a very unexpected manner, that's a state that both either candidate will have to win the election.
That's the biggest.
That's the biggest prize.
Swing state.
And the margins are going to be very thin. So ultimately, it'll come down to voter enthusiasm for the two candidates. Whether more of Trump supporters come out to vote on election day, or whether more of Harris's voters come out. And that will happen tomorrow, and that will really determine the outcome.
So, one interesting thing, and I guess in elections past, other than the 2021, one new phenomenon we're seeing is a lot of people are voting early,
yes,
either by post or by mail-in, by in-person early voting. I think 75 million is the figure that I last checked. That's almost half the electorate.
Yes.
Is there anything in there for us to know that's perhaps the way in which this election is going?
So that has really changed a large part because of COVID. The last election happened during the pandemic, and that led to a lot more early voting. Traditionally, early voting has favored Democrats, and so those are counted later. That suggests that in many states we'll see a blue wave, a Democratic swing later. But it really will depend on a number of other factors. One of the things that's happened this time is this signs that more Republicans are voting early.
Voting early. Okay.
So the balance may not be as skewed towards Democrats as in the past. But again, we'll only know after counting is completed.
Let's talk a little bit about the Indian American community. There's about 2.5 million of them. Generally they've been sort of Democrat leaning. This time, are you seeing anything different?
So traditionally about 2/3 are registered Democrats, about 25% are registered Republicans. There is some indication, there was a recent survey done by the Carnegie Endowment, there's another one of Asian American voters. It suggests that the picture might be a bit more complicated, particularly amongst younger men who might be gravitating more towards the Republican Party. But on balance, I would expect that the majority will still vote Democrat.
Tell us a little bit more about the younger men, because it's not just the Indian American young men. We're seeing that amongst African American young men. We're seeing among Hispanic young men, of course, white young men. Yes. Why are they gravitating towards Trump?
There are many sociological reasons.
So it's the big election in America between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. While there is so much interest in India and around the world as to who will become the next president of the United States, it ultimately boils down to a bunch of swing states, some important communities, whether they show up at the vote or not. We'll also talk about the Indian American community, whether they are overwhelmingly Democrat or they split. Let's try and find a little bit more about this U.S. election, which is being closely watched, with Dhruv Jaishankar, Executive Director with ORF America. Thank you very much, Dhruv, for speaking with us. So, big picture, I mean, we're a day away from election day. Just how big is this election? What are the stakes?
It's a big election. It feels like every 4 years there's a big election in the U.S. It's a very divided polity. Roughly 45% of Americans vote Republican, 45% vote Democrat. And really it's only about 5 to 10% whose opinion has to be swayed each election. And the divides are quite deep across age lines, gender lines, cultural lines, rural, urban. I think there's a big divide there. So I think this is playing out again, as it is every 4 years.
What do you think it'll boil down to? I mean, in such a close race, is it the swing states? Is it who's motivated more? Is it anti-incumbency? What's the big X factor?
There are lots of X factors, which is what's making it hard to predict. The polls show pretty much a 50-50 split. 7 states will really determine this election. They're called the swing states. I find it hard to believe the winner will not be the winner of Pennsylvania. I think that will be a state that just mathematically, unless many other results go in a very unexpected manner, that's a state that both either candidate will have to win the election.
That's the biggest.
That's the biggest prize.
swing
The biggest. And the margins are going to be very thin. So ultimately, it'll come down to voter enthusiasm for the two candidates. Whether more of Trump supporters come out to vote on election day, or whether more of Harris's voters come out. And that will happen tomorrow, and that will really determine the outcome.
So, one interesting thing, and I guess in elections past, other than the 2021, one new phenomenon we're seeing is a lot of people are voting early,
yes,
either by post or by mail-in, by in-person early voting. I think 75 million is the figure that I last checked. That's almost half the electorate.
Yes.
Is there anything in there for us to know that's perhaps the way in which this election is going?
So that has really changed a large part because of COVID. The last election happened during the pandemic, and that led to a lot more early voting. Traditionally, early voting has favored Democrats, and so those are counted later. That suggests that in many states we'll see a blue wave, a Democratic swing later. But it really will depend on a number of other factors. One of the things that's happened this time is this signs that more Republicans are voting early.
Okay.
So the balance may not be as skewed towards Democrats as in the past. But again, we'll only know after counting is completed.
Let's talk a little bit about the Indian American community. There's about 2.5 million of them. Generally they've been sort of Democrat leaning. This time, are you seeing anything different?
So traditionally about 2/3 are registered Democrats, about 25% are registered Republicans. There is some indication, there was a recent survey done by the Carnegie Endowment, there's another one of Asian American voters. It suggests that the picture might be a bit more complicated, particularly amongst younger men who might be gravitating more towards the Republican Party. But on balance, I would expect that the majority will still vote Democrat.
Tell us a little bit more about the younger men, because it's not just the Indian American young men. We're seeing that amongst African American young men. We're seeing among Hispanic young men, of course, white young men. Why are they gravitating towards Trump?
There are many sociological reasons. There's actually a very good book on this, on the sort of frustrations of younger men, particularly in developed economies, including the U.S., that they see fewer opportunities in the job market. They see they think that a sort of liberal agenda that prioritizes certain constituencies, including women, has been to their net disadvantage. And Trump and others seem to channel some of those frustrations. So they see an appeal there, and they see the doors closing on them more within the Democratic Party.
There's also the other side, which is women, at least in this cycle, seem to be very motivated for Harris because of the abortion issue or any.
Yes. So, just for people who don't follow it, this has been a very divisive issue. The Supreme Court in the U.S. overruled Roe v. Wade, which was a landmark legislation that gave essentially reproductive rights to women. And I think the fear among some women is that if Trump is elected, he will put on the courts, including the Supreme Court potentially, more conservative candidates, so that this will become more difficult in the years to come. Whereas, again, a Democratic president, because they get to appoint justices, will put in place more liberal-minded judges.
I want to come back to the Indian American community. One big issue has always been about visas, immigration, H-1B, etc. And I think from the Trump years, people remember that he was very sort of strident on H-1B. Do you see that changing if Trump were to come back to power again?
Absolutely. No, I think there'll be a few. Immigration is a big issue he has campaigned on. Both he at different times and his advisors at different times have had different messages around immigration. Some say he's only focused on illegal immigration, that he doesn't have a problem with legal, particularly high-skilled, which are often very Indians. And again, some of his advisors have emphasized that. But I think there's another issue, which is he plans on actually cutting funding for a lot of immigration processing.
Okay.
And that will, there will be people, and this will happen, I think, to Indians, which is that people who are coming here as students, as business people as on work visas, and they may find that just the bureaucracy is
so it'll take longer.
It'll take much longer. And this happened in between 2017 and 2020. And in fact, what the Biden administration was trying to do is reduce those backlogs. But even now, the wait times that if you go to a consulate or an embassy in India, the wait times are very long. So I think that's not, again, directed at sort of a particular immigration policy per se, but I think those are the kinds of complications that one could anticipate if Trump is elected.
What about on the bilateral relationship itself? I mean, has it got to a stage where it doesn't matter whether a Democrat is president or a Republican is president?
I think it matters. I think the issue is India is not an election issue.
Like Russia is.
Russia is, Israel is, China is to some degree, Iran is, North Korea is even. But India's not, and that's good news. Nobody is campaigning on a tougher line on India, or both are trying to appeal to Indian American voters. I think the emphasis will be different, though. So for Trump, I anticipate that we'll have some challenges on immigration, as I mentioned, but also trade. And this is again not India specific. He wants to change trade policy very broadly, and this may include tariffs against India, which will lead to retaliatory tariffs by India against the U.S. I think with Harris also, I think there may be a shift because there's no guarantee that her advisors will be the same as Biden's advisors. Okay. And I think we may see more of a sort of progressive agenda, again, globally, not directed against any particular country.
But in the context of India, what may that mean?
I think it'll be sort of more, people fear more preachiness on certain issues related to Indian domestic politics, which by and large, actually, the Biden administration has stayed away from. A less strategic approach to the Indo-Pacific, just in the list of priorities that will not be so high. Will there be radical changes? I don't anticipate that, but I do think there'll be some changes around the margins. But it'll depend on personalities.
Just as we sort of wind down, is there any enthusiasm amongst the Indian American community that Harris is of Indian heritage, Indian ancestry, and therefore this is, historic, for want of a better word?
You think it would be a bigger issue than it has been. Surprisingly, it hasn't come up, and one can wonder why. I think primarily she has campaigned as an African-American political figure. And in some ways it makes sense. They're a much larger percentage of the population. That has been her base where she's risen up politically. Yeah. She hasn't shied away from talking about particularly her mother and grandfather, her Indian heritage, the cultural attributes, but nor has she been very enthusiastic in claiming that mantle. So as a result, again, this is more anecdotal, we haven't really seen this, there hasn't been the level of enthusiasm we've seen amongst Indian Americans about this being a potentially historic first Indian American or Indian origin president of the U.S.
All right, and finally, so I know it's close. Everyone's saying, it's going to go down to the wire. It'll boil down to a handful of states. But what does your gut say?
I'm not in the business of making predictions, but I know is mostly to look at the different possibilities. I think one thing to expect is unpredictability. I think every one of the last few elections has surprised in some way, both Indian elections as somebody who follows Indian politics, but also U.S. elections. So I think expect some uncertainty, expect some surprises, even if around the margins. But let's see what happens.
And we can get a result on Tuesday night?
No, we won't. That is something I think that's pretty predictable. We won't get a result, I think, on election night itself, partly by how they count votes. So, a state like Nevada takes sometimes maybe days to count the votes. And if it's a close election, that will matter. Even Pennsylvania will take some time. So I don't think it may take a day or two at the very least to get a full result.
All right, Dhruv Jaishankar, as always, a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us here on CNN News 18. With camera person Chintan Dev Puri at the Farragut Square here in Washington, D.C., this is Zakir Jacob for CNN News 18. It's going to be the closest election in an entire generation in the United States, and on election day, the choice couldn't be more stark between Kamala Harris, the incumbent vice president of the Democratic Party, and Donald Trump, the former president of the Republican Party. Now, it boils down to about half a dozen or so swing states or battleground states, one of which is the state of Michigan. And I'm now joined by the congressman from the 13th District of Michigan. Thank you very much, Sri Thanedar, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start off with Michigan, because this is a must-win state for Vice President Harris. 4 years ago, President Biden carried the state by about 150,000 votes or so. not a very big margin. But this time around, they're saying the concern for the Harris campaign is that a lot of Arab Americans in your state are not willing to back the Democratic ticket because of what's been going on between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So let's start from there. What is your message to them?
Well, look, it's not a single issue election. We are dealing with economy, we're dealing with immigration issues. Biden Harris have created 16 million jobs. The stock market is all-time high. So the inflation is coming down. So it is Biden-Harris administration that has invested in infrastructure. There is just so much good work that has been done under the leadership of Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. And we need to look at it also what Donald Trump means to immigrants. He's always been anti-immigrant. He was the one who brought the Muslim travel ban. So we cannot forget that. He has not been particularly good to the Muslim community in the past, and he would be a disaster on economy, because Democrats always do so well. So I think people need to look at who each of the candidate is, their character. Kamala Harris brings in this joy, a positive candidacy, where Trump is so angry and he's so upset and he is turning off people, like turning off women, Hispanics. He's just been very derogatory, very angry. So it's a difference of a night and a day that people need to look at in an entirety.
Congressman, I do want to ask you about the Indian American community. There's a lot of them in your state, Michigan, as well. Do you see them as some kind of a swing constituency? They used to be always favoring the Democrats, but of late, some within the Indian American community also seem to be backing Trump. Is the Indian American community in your state also split like most other communities as far as this election's choice is concerned?
Yeah, just like, the Arab American community is not a monolithic community. Just like that, the Indian American community is not a monolithic community. We have conservatives, we have liberals, we have moderates in the Indian American community. Their economy is a huge issue. Immigration is a huge issue. And this is the first time an Indian immigrant, Shamala Gopalan's daughter, going to be the next president of the United States. This is a matter of immense pride to the Indian American community. So we cannot forget the fact that she is a daughter of an Indian immigrant. And this is history making. When Kamala Harris becomes the president of the United States, an Indian immigrant's daughter will be sitting there at the most important job in the whole world.
Congressman, I do want to talk to you about one issue which has been rankling a lot of folks back in India and, of course, in the Indian diaspora, both here in the US as well as in Canada, about these attacks that are happening at Hindu places of worship, temples. The Khalistanis are at the forefront of it. How would you speak to those concerns? How would you address those concerns?
Well, look, we are seeing attacks on minority Hindus in different parts of the world. Bangladesh, Hindus are tortured. Their places of worship have been attacked. In the United States, we have seen about 25 different temples have been attacked with graffiti and anti and hate messages. I have spoken with the State Department. I have written to the State Department, and I've asked the State Department that FBI investigate these crimes as hate crimes, and these need to be investigated. Those who are guilty must be punished to the fullest extent of the law. And as a United States Congressman of Indian origin and chairman of the Hindu caucus in the United States Congress, I'm urging Canada, the Prime Minister of Canada, to ensure that the rights of the minority Hindus in Canada are protected, and that they need to get special protection and ensure that such attacks on their places of worship must be stopped and must be investigated. People in Canada Hindus all across the world must be able to practice their religion without fear, without intimidation. And that's what I would ask the Canadian government to ensure and to make sure their human rights are protected.
Viewers, it's all underway in the United States. Polling stations are filling up, and it's going to be a long night. Let me tell you that. But viewers, in the end, the Biden-Harris administration has played true to form. In 2020, when they were elected, many analysts who examine American electoral outcomes from an Indian lens said that the India-US relationship enjoys bipartisan support on Capitol Hill. This measure of goodwill across the aisles will mean that India will retain its star valuation under a Biden Democratic presidency. This takeaway was specially trumped up, excuse the pun, because of Biden's sweep's ethnicity. Yes, Kamala Harris's Indian roots. It was assumed will have the quote potential to change Indian engagement with American politics as well as the United States, unquote, as well as responses to issues in India, unquote. But there was also a small